Vsync is not great, hence why technologies such as FreeSync and Gsync exist. It's popular because it's simple and cheap, but in reality it's not really a good solution to a pretty major problem in gaming. It can cause huge amounts of input lag, which led to me criticizing it in one of my recent videos. However, I didn't really take the time to explain why it's so bad, which of course led to several comments telling me that I'm wrong. Such as this one. Now, I've always had the mantra of not replying to negative comments despite how much I want to correct them. I've always been in the mindset that for every negative comment, there's a ton of other positive comments that actually deserve your response. There's also the idea that if you only reply to negative comments, people will do it just to get attention from you. And then you're just left with entire comment sections of legend has it XXX will reply to this comment. No, I've always tried to give my actual fans my attention, which is why instead of replying to all the negative comments, I'm making an entire video on them. So prepare to get educated about Vsync and frames per second, and maybe at some point we'll talk about TF2. After all, it's in the title of the video. We'll get there, I promise. But before we learn about Vsync, we have to understand what screen tearing is. You've all seen screen tearing before, surely. You know, when you're just trying to play a video game and suddenly there's a big line down your screen. It's a screen tear. But what causes screen tearing? Screen tearing occurs when the FPS of your monitor and the FPS of your graphics card become out of sync. Basically, what happens is the graphics card creates an image and says to the display, "Hey display, draw this image for me." And the display says, "No problem bro, we'll draw that image for you." And so it begins drawing the image. But wait! The graphics card has got a new image, and so it says, "Display, draw this new image." And the display says, "Well, we didn't finish drawing the last image, but sure, whatever." And thus your display ends up showing half of one image and half of another. So how do you fix this? Well, the computing world got together or something, I don't really know, and they came up with vertical synchronization, or Vsync for short. Vsync works by allowing your display to finish drawing an image before being sent a new image. This is good because there's no screen tearing. This is bad because what you're seeing on screen isn't actually what's happening in your graphics card, and therefore isn't actually what's happening in your game. Think about it this way. You move the mouse to look in a new direction. Your GPU creates an image of you looking in a new direction, but if you have Vsync enabled, that image might not be immediately displayed on the screen, and thus some lag is created. It's small, but it definitely adds up. And modern games like Overwatch, modern games like CSGO, where precision is key, have it disabled by default. Older games like TF2, on the other hand, seem to keep it enabled for whatever reason. Really, I guess it's mostly down to personal preference. If you have massive screen tearing issues, turn it on. Otherwise, if you have massive input lag, keep it off. But all this talk about frames per second reminds me of another age-old question. Does FPS actually matter in TF2? Well, the short answer is yes. Or rather, maybe. But the human eye can only see 24 frames per second. Does anyone actually believe this? Or is this just something trolls say to get a reaction? I just want to make sure because I don't believe that anyone could be that stupid. But my monitor only has a 60Hz refresh rate, why would I need more than that? This statement actually is justified, and it makes sense from a logical standpoint. If you can only see 60 of the frames your graphics card is rendering, why would you need to bother with anything more than that? Because the FPS of a game is more than just how many pictures you can see per second. It's also, in most cases, directly related to how many inputs you can get per second. And of course, the more inputs you get per second, the more precise your game is going to be. Let me demonstrate with a Unity project. Here we have a square. We're going to move this square. So let's write some code. Here we have a function called update. So basically whatever we put in update will happen on every single frame of the game. It could happen 300 times per second, it could happen 10 times per second, but all we care about is that it happens every single frame. So here we have some code, and it basically says if we press right, we'll add 0.1 to our square's x coordinate. And if we look at our project, you can see that we're moving right, it works fine. Brilliant. However, if we take our code and put it in a function called fixed update, it'll work slightly differently. Fixed update happens no more than 60 times per second. Therefore, if we look at our square, it's moving a bit slower. This is because it's only being told to go right 60 times per second, as opposed to a potential 300 times per second. And it's useful because the speed of the square will always be the same no matter what your frame rate is. So basically, in short, FPS does matter. But how does this all apply to TF2? Well, pretty much the same way as in my crappy Unity game. The higher your FPS, the more inputs your game is going to be able to receive. And this can change your movement in-game drastically. Not in terms of movement speed, but rather in turn speed and strafing. Or at least it did at one point. Take Star's video on shield turning, for example. He turns less with a low frame rate than he does with a high frame rate. Unfortunately/fortunately, this has since been fixed. Since then, there's also been much debate about whether it affects air strafing. Some say it does, but others say the game has a logical frame rate of 66 frames per second. I would tell you the answer, but I don't actually know the answer. It's a topic that requires more research and documentation, and I'm not skilled enough to do either of those. All I know is that for me, 300 FPS feels a lot better than 60. It feels a lot more responsive, but for all I know, that's maybe just the placebo effect. It is based on programming knowledge though, so I'm not entirely stupid, am I?
This meme will never die, because are in the bin. Are in the bin. Are in the bin.